Welcome back, everyone. Anytime I get to talk about a PlayStation console or just any gaming console at all, it's always a good day. And today we're going to be talking about the PlayStation Vita. And I've been talking so much time about the PlayStation 3s and the PlayStation 5s and even the Nintendo consoles, bro. We have to take it back to a console that, in my opinion, is pretty underrated and probably maybe for a couple of good reasons, maybe not, but I think the PlayStation Vita at the end of the day is actually a pretty decent console. And if you're somebody who wants to pick this console up even now in 2020, I don't think it's a bad deal. I mean, of course, if you have the money, probably go for like a Nintendo Switch that might last you longer, and also that console is like getting updates still and still has a lot of life left in it in terms of the games that are coming out. But if you're a diehard Sony fan, I think the PlayStation Vita is still a pretty decent console. Now, the PlayStation P, which was the predecessor to this, obviously was a huge market success, I think, for the most part. Of course, they had a couple different consoles, the PSP 3000, PSP 2000, all those ones, but even the PSP Go, and I've reviewed every single one of those except one, that is the PSP Street, which I will be reviewing soon. I've been having that for like a year. I still haven't reviewed it yet. And that set of consoles were super cool, and they brought a lot to the table. And then the PS Vita came out in 2012, which honestly feels like yesterday, dude. This thing does not feel like it came out in 2012. I feel like this thing came out even sooner than that, which is pretty crazy. And when this thing came out, right, looking on the front, you can see the whole entire design is pretty much the same as, the previous console. Some things have changed for sure, but the whole entire design, the way it looks, is almost exactly the same, to be honest. Now, looking on the front of this display, we have a 5-inch OLED display on the beginning PS Vitas, but eventually they did switch to an IPS panel, which I honestly don't know how I feel about that. I kind of liked the IPS. I kind of liked the OLED panel before, and that's the one I have. I have the original one, but it's not that big of a deal. If you guys get the IPS one, I don't think you're really going to complain too much about it. Now, you can see the buttons on the sides. You have the arrow keys on the left, but you also have a joystick on the bottom of that, which is cool. It was really reminiscent of the original PSP, so it's kind of in the same spot. But this joystick was more in tune with something like the PS3's controller or something like that, rather than something like a PS Vita or PSP, to be honest. Obviously, it's the PS Vita, but this joystick for sure at the end of the day felt more like the PS3's joystick than this one. But honestly, I liked the PSP's joystick. I kind of liked how that was, just because it had that really cool texture and it felt so different. This one kind of felt the same, and honestly, the other thing with this specific joystick is that when you put it in your pocket or something like that, it tends to, I don't know why, but like the joysticks always get stuck into your pocket, so it's always hard to pull out and pull forward. That was something that was kind of annoying. It wasn't that humongous of a deal, but that is something to kind of consider. And you also have that PlayStation button underneath that and a little speaker grill on the side of that. And on the right side, this is where things get a little bit interesting. You have obviously the triangle, square, circle, X buttons right there. Right underneath that, you have another joystick, which is really cool. I'm glad this thing had two. You were able to get much more kind of, features in two games and things like that. And you had that joystick, which is really cool. But right underneath that, you had the select and start button and a speaker grill. But above those two things, you had a front-facing camera, which honestly, at the end of the day, is something that I don't know why these consoles need front-facing cameras. I think it's cool. I think it's an additional feature. I'm not really hating on it too much, but that is honestly something that's really funny. A console like the Nintendo Switch doesn't have any cameras on it. Even the Nintendo Switch Lite, those don't have any cameras on it at all, but they're still super high successes. And that just goes to show, even like the 3DS's had the cameras. It's like kind of unnecessary, to be honest. But it is what it is at the end of the day. On the bottom, charging brick, headphone jack. On the top, the PS Vita game card, and also the SD card slot. You also had the volume buttons on the top, left, right buttons. And on the back, this is where things get interesting. So the back actually had a touch-sensitive back, which is really cool. So in certain games, you could actually rub the back and get some cool controls from certain games in that too, which is really cool. Now, me personally, I don't think I have a game that utilizes that, but I've seen some gameplay of it and I think it's really cool. And even though it didn't really take off too much, you had that capability, which is really awesome. Now, one thing and a huge caveat going from a console like the PSP to the PS Vita was the change of game cards. So if you had a PSP 3000 or PSP Street or whatever, and you wanted to go play games on your PS Vita, you want to play those PSP games, you couldn't necessarily do that because obviously the UMD slot, there's not one on the PS Vita. And for a console like that in 2020, what I will tell you is the PSP had so many cool games out for it, and the PS Vita had some games out for it too, but I definitely do think the PSP's lineup is definitely far more superior than the PS Vita's, and that is something that actually took the PS Vita kind of a couple notches down, to be honest. The backwards compatibility of this thing, it's just not there, which is something that's really, really sad. You look at consoles like the Nintendo DS, even consoles like the Nintendo Wii U, those are pretty much backwards compatible with a lot of other consoles, and you look at something especially like the Nintendo 3DS and the 3DS XL, that is basically this PS Vita's main competitor, and you're basically able to see that the Nintendo 3DS and 3DS XL can not only play all those 3DS games, but it can also play all those Nintendo DS games as well, which a lot of them had pretty much the same counterpart to the PS Vita and PSP lineup. If a game came out for the PSP, most of the time it would also come out for the Nintendo DS. Granted, graphics and everything weren't the best, but you still have that whole selection of games to choose from. And in this specific console, it could not do that, which is honestly kind of sad. And another thing, I don't know why Sony does it. Well, I know why they do it, because it makes them a ton of money. But that memory card, that is only specific for the PS Vita. There's no other consoles out there that use that specific SD card, which is very, very weird. And it's another thing where Sony's trying to pocket out people. They did the same thing with the PSP too. But honestly, if you can look over those couple gripes, the PS Vita is still a pretty decent console. And I say that after all those things because of the hardware, this thing still feels like a very good console. My PSP 3000, PSP 2000, PSP 1000, my PSP Go even. Now the PSP Go is a little different, but those consoles, I can tell they don't really feel that good anymore. They've been thrown around, they've put in boxes with so many other consoles, they get jumbled around, they just don't feel that good. Parts are chipping off and everything, but the PS Vita has held up very, very well. It still feels like a very decent portable console, and I think it's up there with my Nintendo 3DS XL. I think it feels a little bit more premium than that, but the really cool thing about the PS Vita is the modding capability, and there's so much I could say about it, but what I will say is that if you are getting a PS Vita, if you're able to modify this thing, you can definitely gain so much access and have a much better experience from a console from a modded PS Vita than a non-modded console. Now, what I will say is that I don't know if all consoles are able to be modded, if all PS Vitas are able to be modded. I think they are, but I could totally be wrong. So kind of keep that in mind. I'm not going to sit here and say I'm an expert at this, because I'm totally not. But as far as I know, if you go on the subreddit for PS Vita and you kind of read more about it, I think it's PS Vita Hacks or some subreddit like that. If you Google it, I'm sure you'll find it. There is still a huge community behind this thing even now in 2020, which is pretty insane. So for a console that came out in 2012, for it to still be pretty popping is pretty impressive. You look at consoles like the Nintendo Wii U, that is okay, but 3DS and 3DS XL has a humongous community behind it still. The PS Vita is in the middle, which is still pretty decent. With a console like the PS Vita, not only can you play all those PS Vita games and cartridges that you legally own, but you can also legally play those PSP UMD games from before too with emulators. And again, you have to legally do it. I'm not telling you to modify. I'm not telling you to illegally do anything. I'm not condoning that at all. But you have that capability from a PS Vita, which you don't necessarily have that from a non-modded PS Vita. So that's why I would recommend you to do that. Also, another thing to keep in mind is that if you don't want to do that, the games for this thing are super cheap too. That, they're not really making PS Vita games anymore, I don't think. So this thing still has a humongous community behind it. Now, the main question that I always see is that, is Sony going to make a PS Vita 2? And for that answer, I honestly don't know. I don't think they're going to. They're making the PlayStation 5 as we know, but for them to make a PlayStation Vita 2, it would mean that they still see a huge market share of portable consoles and portable gaming, and I don't think a lot of people want to do that. I don't think people want a dedicated gaming portable console as much as they do as something like a Nintendo Switch, which is kind of like both. It's a portable one and also, a docking one that you can play with your screen and everything. And if Sony does that route, I think they can definitely have a hit on their hands. We've seen Nintendo even go from making the 3DSs and 3DS XLs to only really producing the 2DS XL because that's the one that's best selling. Because Nintendo even knows that a majority of people aren't even playing with the 3DS XL anymore. You look at something like the Nintendo Switch Lite, which also has pretty good sales, but that's really because the Nintendo Switch was a huge successor, so they could do another, kind of not even a successor to it, but an accessory to it, which would be the Nintendo Switch Lite. So what I would tell you at the end of the day is that the PlayStation Vita sits in a very weird spot. I think it's still a great console. I think it has a lot going for it. If you modify it, if you're not going to modify it, then I think it sits in a weird spot from it being, a pretty good console to it being a very great console. if you modify it. So I'll let you guys kind of do the research from there. I could drop a video on it on my second channel. If you guys want a tutorial on how to modify it, I probably could drop that today, maybe next week. I don't know. We're all inside anyway, so. But I think if you're also in the market, getting a Nintendo Switch Lite would also do you pretty well. These things, I've seen them go for about like $50, $60 sometimes. Surprisingly, the PSP Go's are more expensive than this thing, which doesn't make any sense. Those are like collector's items at this point. And I just spent like over $100 on mine, which was a total waste. I spent like $20 on my PSP 3000, and I spent less money on this one, but it is what it is. It's not that big of a deal. So like I stated, if you're in the market for a PS Vita, I'll see if there's any on Amazon, and I'll link them down below. But that's really pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys could hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate it if you guys could check it out. More importantly, everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.